This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's Michigan Medicine Well Aware presentation. We look forward to discussing the COVID-19 vaccines, an inside look at the development and rollout. Let me also say thanks to all of you who submitted a question on the RSVP form. We will be working to answer many of those throughout the presentations and later during our Q&A. We also will be accepting live questions during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. For those joining us via the Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. and we will do our best to get through as many as possible. Before we begin, we'd like to take a quick poll. How many of you are planning on getting the COVID-19 vaccine? So that is, will you take the vaccine? Yes, no, or you're still undecided. So we'll give you a little bit of time to mull that over. Okay, wow, so this is great. It looks like 92% of you said yes, you will get the vaccine, which is awesome news, as we'll need a majority of the population to take the vaccine in order to gain herd immunity. For the few of you that said no or that you were still undecided, hopefully our experts will be able to address any questions or concerns you might have about the vaccines. And with that, let's meet our experts. First, we have Anna Locke, who is the Alice Lorman Andrews Research Professor of Hepatology and Professor of Internal Medicine. She's also the Director of Clinical Hepatology and Assistant Dean for Clinical Research, and she will share information on vaccine development and clinical trials. Next, we have Najira Lagogo, the Associate Professor of Internal Medicine and the Medical Director of the Michigan Clinical Research Unit, who will present on vaccine trials at Michigan Medicine. Then we have Sandro Senti, Professor of Internal Medicine, who will focus on the vaccine rollout prioritization phases. And finally, Stan Kent, Chief Pharmacy Officer and Associate Dean for Clinical Affairs in the College of Pharmacy, who will provide details on vaccine rollout logistics. Now, I'd like to invite Dr. Locke to join us for her presentation.
So thank you, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, and it's very nice to meet everyone. So what I'll be talking about is really the vaccine development and the clinical trials that lead to the approval of these vaccines. Next slide, please. So how do we make these vaccines? The first thing is we need to identify the virus that caused COVID-19. Then we need to figure out which part of the virus we need to attack, which part of this virus helps the virus gain entry into our cells. So once we identify that, we make the vaccine, we have to test it in the laboratory, then we test it in animals, and ultimately we test it in humans. When we do clinical trials, they divide it into phase 1, 2, and 3. So phase 3 is the large scale, tens of thousands of people to really prove that it is safe, to prove that it works, and that leads to approval. Normally that takes time, but because of the urgency of COVID-19, the FDA has a mechanism which is called emergency use approval. It still undergoes very vigorous scrutiny and approval. And ultimately, as the full data become available, there will be further review and final official full approval. After that, it's available, scale up manufacturing and distribution. Next slide. So normally, this is a very slow process, multiple steps occurring in sequence and oftentimes take years, quite frequently 10 years or longer. With COVID-19 recognizing how urgent it is, the steps are occurring simultaneously. So we actually have the first vaccine distributed less than 12 months from identifying the virus. It's the fastest ever. And this is due to a lot of collaboration among the scientists. So the first case of COVID-19 was recognized in late December 2019. The virus was identified in early January 2020. And that information is widely shared, allowing scientists in different countries to work together. In this country, you have all heard of the Operation Warp Speed, which is initiated by the government, the NIH, as well as the federal government, together with scientists, the industry that make these vaccines, and FDA. And there were billions of dollars invested from the government, allowing the scale up of this approach. Currently, there's 60 different vaccines in clinical trials, 15 of them in the late phase 3. Next slide. So I mentioned we have to identify which part of the virus we need to attack. And you've heard about the spike or the S protein. So this is basically the envelope of the virus. And there's this protein that sticks out. That's why it's called a spike protein. It attaches to the human liver cells, and through a receptor, it gains entry into the cells, multiply, and cause damage. So the vaccines are directed against these spike proteins, inducing immunity to the protein so that the virus cannot gain entry into human cells. Next slide. Many of you have also heard that, well, the current vaccines use this novel platform and we've not used this before. Most of us have received vaccination in one form or another, the flu vaccine, or as a kid, we have the polio vaccine and others. Oftentimes, the traditional vaccines are, we use a virus that we kill the virus so that they can induce immunity but not cause infection, or we cause weakening of the virus. Or we actually identify the protein that is important and we make the protein and we just introduce the protein but not the virus to enhance immunity. But here we actually use the DNA or the RNA of the virus. We all know that the DNA is our genetic coding. It carries the code and makes the RNA, and the RNA in turn makes the protein. This is how our genetic information allows our body to function. The two vaccines that are currently approved both use the messenger RNA to carry the genetic information for this spike protein. So that's injected into our body, and our body then make the protein. And because it only makes the spike protein but not the virus, so it cannot cause infection and induces immunity. There are also other vaccines that use a viral vector that Dr. Lugogo would tell you later on. And you say, why do we use this new platform? It's just because this allows us to very quickly make those vaccines. So instead of having to make the protein and purify them in huge amount, we just let everyone, you make the protein yourself. We just give you the recipe and you do it yourself. Next slide. So the two vaccines that are available and distributed in this country right now are made by Pfizer and Moderna. They're very similar. They both use the RNA to get into our body and make the protein. They both involve 2 doses. The first dose followed by either 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later. They've both been tested in a lot of people. The Pfizer vaccine in more than 40,000 and Moderna in 30,000. And it's a very wide spectrum of people, including mostly Caucasians, but 10% African Americans in both studies, and about 20% Hispanics. And they've both been shown to be very effective in preventing symptomatic infection. 95%, 94%, equally effective regardless of race and ethnicity. And we have safety up to 2 months after the second dose, showing that these vaccines are very, very safe. Next slide. So what about side effects? Many of these vaccines do have side effects. They tend to be very mild, last for 1 or 2 days. There are 2 types of side effects. So here I show the 2 vaccine types. In blue are the people who received the vaccine. In orange are the people who received the placebo. Not surprisingly, people who received the vaccine have more side effects, but these side effects are mild. They tend to be the local reactions, a little bit of pain and swelling where you get the injection. Systemic reactions are fever and headache, but again, they tend to be mild and go away in 1 or 2 days. Next slide. So finally, you would say, well, why are you guys still doing vaccine trials? We have 2 already, isn't it enough? And that's because there's still a lot of gaps in knowledge. We still don't know if vaccines prevent mild infections, people with infection without symptoms. How long does the protection last? Everyone wants to know. Do the vaccines protect against new variants? What about pregnant women? What about children? What about people whose immune system is suppressed? We also know that we hear about there's not enough vaccines to go around. And it's not just in Michigan, in this country, but the whole world. We need to protect the whole world. And we can't rely on just 2 companies to make enough for the whole world. So we need more. We also need more vaccines that may not necessarily need freezers. Maybe just a fridge would be good enough. And potentially other vaccines that will be effective with just one dose. So there's still a lot more to learn. And that's where clinical trials come into place. And that's what Dr. Lugogo is going to tell us about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Locke. That was great. It's great to know how much scientific work has gone into and continues to go into bringing multiple safe and effective vaccines to market. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Najira Lugogo for her presentation.
Thank you so much. I will transition to talking about the COVID-19 vaccine trials that were done here at the University of Michigan. The first thing I think that's quite important to understand is how vaccines work. And essentially, vaccines are trying to mimic your own body's immune response to viruses, bacteria, and other microbes that you might experience in regular infection. So normally you would get an infection, your immune system would respond to the infection, but it can take sometimes up to 2 weeks to develop antibodies to fight off the infection. And in that process, the infection can become severe, and in some cases, patients don't survive. So what we want to do is introduce a piece of that virus, for example, for COVID, into your body using a vaccine. And like Dr. Locke said, these are weakened or killed forms of the virus, and so it shouldn't cause any infection. But your immune system, which is always on alert and surveilling to see if there are any intruders, will notice that there is a foreign piece of material that has come into your body, and it will respond. And the way it responds is what we call T cells. And the T cells are going to be those future surveillance team that is aware of what the spike protein looks like. And so in the future, if you ever get exposed to COVID, for instance, the T cells will immediately send an alert to your B cells to say, wait a minute, this person is not supposed to be here, and we need to have a rapid response and get rid of this virus before the body gets infected and you become sick. And then the B cells are what produce the antibodies that kill the virus when it comes into your body. And so the vaccines are able to allow you to have those 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And most of these vaccines are given twice. So at about 2 months, you're going to have your surveillance system all primed and ready to go, as well as your antibodies. And in the future, that will protect you if you're ever exposed to COVID. Next slide, please. So how do viral vectors vaccines work? These are the vaccines that we studied here at the University of Michigan. And basically, they've taken a weakened cold virus or adenovirus. In one case, it's a chimpanzee adenovirus. In another case, it's a very rare human adenovirus. And they take the adenovirus and put a little piece of the protein inside the adenovirus cover or vector, making the adenovirus like a Trojan horse, bringing the protein into your body. And when you inject that weakened adenovirus into the system, your body recognizes it and immediately comes into response, sees the spike protein, and induces an immune response. Here at Michigan, we did 2 clinical trials. One was with AstraZeneca, Oxford University. The other one was Johnson & Johnson Janssen. Both of these were using the adenovirus platform, both a phase 3 double-blinded placebo. The randomization varied between the two. With Janssen, it was 1 dose, and with AstraZeneca, there were 2 doses, and we are currently following our patients for about 2 years. The Oxford vaccine studies actually, the AstraZeneca vaccine study is actually still ongoing. We are currently still recruiting adults over 65 and minority patients. Otherwise, we have enrolled well over 30,000 people across the world, 26,000 or more from the US. And here at Michigan, we've enrolled about 212 patients. In the Janssen study that closed in December, we enrolled 149 patients. We talked to a lot of the participants about why they were interested in volunteering. And you can see here there was a variety of reasons. Unfortunately, some of the patients had been exposed, had family members that had unfortunately passed away from COVID, and they wanted to do something to feel like they could help other people not go through the same experience. There were people who are dedicated to science or to being part of the solution. A lot of our older patients wanted solutions that would help their children and grandchildren. And, most of these studies did not allow people under 18 to participate. And so they wanted to give back, be able to further the science. And then we had a lot of people from particular communities, particularly underrepresented minority communities, that wanted to participate as an example to others and to also help us get information on safety and efficacy so that when the vaccine comes out for use, those other folks from the minority communities would feel comfortable that this vaccine was in fact studied. So there were many challenges. We had to start these studies very rapidly. It took us about 1 month to get going, which is quite a big challenge when you're developing a very big study. We had to hire and develop infrastructure in order for the vaccine studies to be successful. And I believe we're quite successful. We've enrolled a very diverse population of patients. We partnered with other people across campus, including at MISHAR, in order to improve recruitment. And we collaborated at unprecedented levels all across the campus in order to successfully enroll patients, which allowed us to run 2 concurrent vaccine trials at the University of Michigan and helped us to contribute to being part of a solution to this very important challenge that we all face.
Thank you, Dr. Lagogo, for all the amazing work and the implementation done by the trial team. And a big thank you to the trial participants as well.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to welcome our next presenter, Dr. Sandro Senti.
Hello, how are you? And thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to talk about how we're rolling this out and a little bit about how the CDC made decisions on priority groups. Many of you will have questions about that, but this is our structure of our COVID vaccine therapeutics and task force. Myself, Dr. Kent, who's going to speak to you, and Dana Habers got this group together in November. On November 2nd, we started vaccinating on December 13th and have vaccinated about 22,000 people so far. So it's been a very active effort that has involved probably over 100 people by now. Each of these bubbles here represents a team, and the leaders of that team are about 60 people on our vaccine task force. So it's a lot. One day I will meet Dana and Stan in person. So that I'm looking forward to once we get this done. Let's go forward. The ACIP is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and it's a vaccine work group that works for the CDC, and they make the decisions on allocation. Let's move forward. They're really relying on the principles of preventing death and people getting sick, morbidity and mortality, and also preservation of social functioning. Those are the 2 things that they're looking at. They're also, let's go to the next slide. They're also looking at how do you balance the science, which is how good are these vaccines, how well do they work, are they safe, the implementation, how quickly can we get these to arms, and the ethics, which is how do we get this to, how do we deal with disparities and get these to the right groups and to the people that need them, as well as everybody eventually. Let's move forward. These are the work group considered these in balancing the goals here. And so in our first stage, which was phase 1A, which you can see here, in terms of prevention of morbidity and mortality, they really went after the long-term care facilities, and those are still going on now in our state and many other states. And then to preserve societal functioning, healthcare personnel were put in that highest tier. So we're just finishing up with that group, and we're about to go into phase 1B. Now, 1B at our state is people who are 65 years and older, and also frontline essential workers. And those are people who can't help but have closer contact than 6 feet with other people. Those would be food workers, those would be police and fire, those would be people who work within the prison system, and those frontline essential workers have to be protected early, and that's the group that's coming up. 1C will be people who are who have medical conditions. The CDC said people 65 to 74, but most states are going to get those people in 1B. And then other essential workers. So there are workers that work in IT, for instance, in food services where they don't have close contact with other people that also need to be protected. So all these groups are going to be vaccinated eventually. And then phase 2, if you see phase 2 in gray here, is everybody in the country. We hope to get 70% or more vaccinated, because in that case, we will get herd immunity. This shows how the phases have been playing out, and we are currently finishing phase 1A and pretty much on schedule, because if you look at the weeks, we've been doing phase 1A for about 4 weeks and are eliding now into phase 1B. Phase 1C is probably 2 to 3 months down the line. Vaccine, we've had a little trouble with vaccine supply, and in Michigan and at University of Michigan right now, we're only able to do the second doses of our Pfizer vaccinated people because we don't have enough for first doses. We're hoping that that will change, and eventually we hope, because of some announcements at the national level, that we will have much more access. At the University of Michigan, we're able now to do about 3,500 to 4,000 patients a day, and we hope to increase that even more. I think that's it, and I'll turn you over to Stan.
Thank you, Dr. Senti.
You're welcome.
It's good to have that insight into how the vaccine priorities are determined. And last but definitely not least, I'd like to introduce Stan Kent.
Good afternoon. Yeah, next slide. Okay, great. So this is a little bit of a fun slide. As we were planning for implementation of this vaccine and began to read through the masses of information from the CDC and the state and the pharmaceutical companies, one of the pharmacy managers mentioned that this is incredibly complicated. So next slide, please. So when it comes to logistics of the components of the implementation of the vaccine, there really are 3 areas. It's ordering the vaccine, receiving it, making sure it's stored properly and transported from place to place. And then there's an incredible amount of documentation and inventory management that goes along with it, as you can imagine. And while this, activity is behind the scenes for the most part and rather mundane, it's also really important that we get it right. So next slide, please. This is a flow chart of the basic ordering and receiving process that we go through every week. On Thursdays at noon, we place an order with the state of Michigan. And so that, just happened today. On Friday, the state of Michigan gets confirmation from the federal government about what the allocation will be for the state. And then they pass that information along to us. So we may order 20,000 doses because that's what we think we could administer the next week, but we may only receive a smaller supply. And in fact, that's been the case every week up to this point because of the lack of supply of vaccine. Once we know how many vaccines we will get the next week, we can begin to schedule appointments for patients. So you have to remember, this is the type of vaccine that you can't just show up to get whenever you want. We have to make sure that we have enough vaccine for appointments scheduled. And And then on Sunday, we received confirmation from the manufacturer. Right now, we only have the Pfizer vaccine, and we get a tracking number from UPS. On Tuesday morning, we usually receive that vaccine, and we administer it the following Wednesday to Tuesday. So that's the ordering and receiving cycle. Next slide, please. So one of the things that was really challenging related to this vaccine was the storage conditions. It needs to be stored at ultra cold temperatures, minus 70 degrees. I included here some information from one of the CDC documents that talks about, the shipment, the handling, on-site storage, what you have to do with the vaccine once you take it out of the refrigerator, how long it's good for, in different conditions. So they have a sheet like this for each vaccine. Next slide. And this was just a table that we put together for the 4 likely candidates of vaccines that we think we'll be using this year. As I mentioned, we're only using the Pfizer vaccine at this point, although we hope to soon be using the Moderna vaccine. And in the state of Michigan, the Moderna vaccine has largely been allocated to the community pharmacies for treating patients in long-term care facilities or vaccinating patients in LTCFs. AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines that we did research with here at Michigan, we'll hope to see them later this year. Next slide, please. So on the pharmacy department, an important component of managing this is inventory management. And because these vaccines have to be stored under ultra cold conditions and have limited stability when they're removed, we have to continuously monitor the temperature under which they're stored with using digital devices. And then on top of that, one of the agencies also requires us to manually twice a day record temperatures on a paper log, believe it or not. Then we have to report the amount of inventory on hand to the CDC using a website they call Vaccine Finder. And we also have to report our daily inventory on hand to the state of Michigan. Since this is a scarce resource, there's a lot of security precautions taken related to storage of these vaccines. And we have them stored in areas with card access, and they're controlled with cameras as well. What you see there is one of the technicians holding 5 trays of the Pfizer vaccine. Next slide. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Stan. You covered a lot of information in a short amount of time, and I know we have many questions awaiting us. So I'd like to invite all of the panelists back to the stage. And I'd also like to note that our panelists cannot give personal patient recommendations, but they can give generalized medical advice. So we're now going to dive into the Q&A portion of the webinar, taking a few questions that were asked pre-event, followed by our live Q&A using the Q&A Zoom feature. All right. So is everyone ready? Okay. Our first question, does it matter which vaccine I get? And I'll start with you, Dr. Locke, for that one.
It doesn't matter. A vaccine is a vaccine, and the sooner you can get it, the better. So I wouldn't keep waiting.
Great. Anyone else have anything to add?
The second dose would matter. But the first dose, I would agree with Dr. Locke. You want to get a vaccine that's available, but most of the vaccines, except for Janssen, I think has 2 doses, and so you want to get the same first dose in your second dose.
Great, good
Yes,
point.
absolutely. Get out there and get it.
Okay, our next question, how much does the vaccine cost, Dr. Senti?
0. Yeah, it shouldn't cost anything. The federal government's paying for this. There may be some costs that are associated with administering the vaccine, but that's going to be very different in places that you go. But it shouldn't cost patients anything. They should not be asked to pull out their credit cards or their cash.
That's great. Okay, our next question, how long will the vaccine be effective? And will we be required to get revaccinated every year? Dr. Senti, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I can start with that. The answer is we don't know. There's evidence now coming out if you get naturally infected that there's protection up to about 8 months. So we expect that this vaccine will work for at least that long. Will we have to do it every year? We don't know that yet. It's still unknown.
Okay. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
In the clinical trials, that's why we are following people for 2 years.
Yeah.
So then we can get a good understanding on how long immunity lasts, and more importantly, how long these vaccines will protect the patients who receive them.
Great. Okay, so on to
And
our next.
can I make one point about efficacy?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
efficacy is people don't get infected, but there's also decreased severity of disease. And so that's a very important thing. If we give this vaccine, will we be preventing, maybe people will get infected, but they won't be getting it coming into the hospital or going to the emergency department. So it's an important distinction to make, and that may last even longer.
Great. Okay, so our next question, for those people who have received 2 doses of vaccine and are then exposed to COVID, are there modified guidelines for quarantine, or will the current recommendations still apply regardless of vaccination status? Dr. Lugogo, what say you?
Unfortunately, you still have to be careful. Getting the vaccine, it's not a miracle. Unfortunately, you can get some subclinical infection or asymptomatic infection. We don't know yet if the vaccine completely eliminates the occurrence of infection. It's more likely that some people may still get infected, but very, very mild infection. And as long as you're around other people who have not been vaccinated, there is a risk of transmitting the virus to other individuals. And so I would say that you still have to follow the same guidelines, at least for the foreseeable future while we roll out the vaccine. And that may change in the future, but not anytime soon.
Okay, so still wear your mask, still social distance. Okay. Our next question, with the mutation of the virus, so we've been hearing about new variants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, will the current vaccines still be effective? Stan, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, so what we think right now is that the vaccines will be effective against these other strains of the virus, as long as, the way it works is it works on the spike protein part of the virus. So as long as when the virus mutates, that spike protein that attaches to our cells is still affected, then we expect that it would work against variants. But, as we know, viruses, mutate a lot, like the flu virus. And so we just have to really sort of keep our eye on it. I don't know, Sandro, anything to add to that?
No, I agree. I think the chance that this most recent variant that started in the UK attaches more avidly and may be more likely to infect somebody, but it's not resistant to vaccine as far as anybody knows, and it wouldn't be predicted that it would be resistant, as Stan said. the mutations that occur much more frequently when there's a lot of virus in the community. As we get a hold of this virus and it goes down, the mutation rates will go down. And usually coronaviruses don't mutate as much as flu virus. Remember, flu virus can change almost every year. Coronaviruses usually are slower than that, except when they're infecting a lot of the population. So that we'll have to keep an eye on.
Yeah,
okay, that's good news for the vaccine. Go ahead, Stan.
Yeah, I was going to say the other thing that I think people should know is as the viruses mutate, and if there's a new strain to which the current vaccine isn't effective, with the technology that we have now with mRNA technology, we can come up with a new vaccine really pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's a good point because one of the reasons why this technology can produce a vaccine so quickly is you have the mechanisms in place. It's like you have the box and all you need to do is really just insert that little piece in and you can swap it out and put a new piece in. But we think that the immunity that is being stimulated is very broad. So the likelihood that the vaccines are not going to be effective, at least in the short run, is going to be extremely low. And hopefully with enough people getting vaccinated, an infection rate goes down, there won't be enough time for the virus to undergo massive changes that make the vaccines ineffective.
Okay. So our next question, what could be the potential long-term side effects of the new vaccines? Dr. Locke, I know you mentioned short-term, like a sore arm, but do you know anything about potential long-term side effects?
So for this particular vaccine, obviously, we don't really have any long-term results because it's only available very short-term. If you look at other vaccines that we know very often, most of the side effects are really very early, within days, maybe within weeks. They're extremely rare side effects that occur more than a few weeks after the vaccination. So expect that there'll be little or no long-term late side effects. There are always sort of unknowns with new things that we don't know. But that's, again, the important reason why we keep the clinical trials ongoing, that we follow people for up to 2 years to see if there are unexpected things that crop up later on.
Okay, great. So our next question, if you are immune suppressed or you have allergies, which vaccine should you get or does it matter? Dr. Senti.
Those are two questions that I'll try to answer. If you're immune suppressed, there's a possibility that the vaccine will have a little less effectiveness, but we are still saying you need to get vaccinated. And there will be some level of effectiveness from getting the vaccine. If you have allergies, it's important to let the people who are vaccinating you know that you have allergies, particularly if you have what are called anaphylactic allergies. Where you have to carry an EpiPen. And it doesn't mean you can't get the vaccine. It just means that you have to be monitored and you'll probably have to stay 30 minutes instead of 15 minutes and be monitored. So neither of those, unless you've had an anaphylactic response to the vaccine or any of the components in the current vaccine, that's the only time where you wouldn't be able to get a second dose. But even in that situation, our allergists are working on a way that they can give people the second dose, even if they had a reaction to the first. Because one thing that's very clear, as Dr. Locke brought up, we're going to be and Dr. Kent also, we're going to be making more of these mRNA vaccines because they're so effective, they're so easy to make, and as from what we're hearing, they're very safe too. So we want to be able to know that people that get these vaccines won't have allergies to other vaccines that they get in the future that are made in this way.
Well, the other thing that I might add to it is the allergic reaction is not necessary to the mRNA. The vaccine contains other ingredients like a carrier because there are people who ask, how does the mRNA get into my cells? There's actually a carrier that carries the mRNA into our cells. So sometimes it's really allergic reaction to these other components. And different vaccines have slightly different chemical composition of these other components. So as we learn more, we may be able to make vaccines that don't have certain chemicals that people are more commonly allergic to. The other comment I would make for people who has a weakened immune system, as we learned from other vaccines, your ability to mount a response to the vaccine may be weaker, but you also have to balance against, if I get infected, I'm going to be a lot sicker. So the benefits still way outweigh the likelihood that you might not get 95%, maybe 90%. That's much better than nothing.
Okay, so we've got a lot of questions coming in. When Michigan Medicine starts scheduling appointments for those 65 and over, how are the individuals being prioritized?
I can answer. I can start with that. So for the moment, remember I showed you those three circles, and one of those is implementation. And in order to get people through, and in order to get vaccine to arms, what we're really doing is using a randomization process. So people from the age of 65 and over will be randomized, and then schedules, and then they will be messages will be sent out in a randomized fashion. Again, the ethics part of that too, to be called in to get vaccines at a certain point. So those will go out in batches. It won't go out, we won't send out 200 invitations at one point, probably several thousand at a time. Both from 65 and over, the increased risk of death is about 5 to 10%. So we really want to get that population vaccinated as quickly as we can, but we also have to be aware that we want to do it fairly, equitably, ethically.
Yeah, we have approximately 200,000 patients in our system that are over the age of 65. So clearly there isn't enough vaccine for all of them right away, and that's why there will be a randomization process. But the good news was that the federal government and the state announced this week that they are going to be releasing more vaccine. So we had hoped to get those invitations out this week, but because we didn't get vaccine this week that we had hoped for, we're hoping to do it next week.
Great. I know a lot of people are excited. Okay, so is there any guidance on pregnant or breastfeeding women and taking the vaccine?
Yes, all the organizations, ACOG, which is the American Society of Obstetrics and Gynecology, says pregnant women should, because they're in one of the high-risk categories. Same thing with the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine also says that. We've run that by our OB folks here, and they're all saying strongly that women who are pregnant should very strongly consider getting the vaccine, have discussions with their OB docs, but there's no reason to think it wouldn't be safe in those populations. The same with women who are breastfeeding, that there's no evidence that it's going to be transmitted to the child in either case.
Okay. Can panelists talk about future vaccines that are coming online and where and when they might be introduced?
I can start. I just read something this morning, actually, about the AstraZeneca vaccine. They probably that will come out sometime towards March or April, as will the Janssen vaccines. They're getting pretty close to completing their clinical trials, and we're hoping that the effectiveness outcomes are similar to what we've seen with Pfizer and Moderna. And I haven't read anything about significant safety concerns, so hopefully it'll follow the same path. And then it just has to go through the approval process similar to Moderna and Pfizer, but those are all accelerated. So I think by April, we might have 2 more vaccines. I don't know, other people might want to chime in as well.
Yeah, the Janssen studies. There are two studies actually, Ensemble 1 and 2. The Ensemble 2 gives a booster dose. So we'll have an answer about whether one dose is equivalent to two doses from that study. The Ensemble 1 study is very close to analyzing their data. The AstraZeneca study is still enrolling and hoping to finish enrolling in the next week or so. And so they're all basically working very hard to get information out. There were other studies and platforms. It gets more complicated to do clinical trials with placebo once you have EUA vaccines or you have approved vaccines. So those studies, I don't know, the other candidates are probably going to have to find different outcomes, like maybe just looking at seroconversion and antibody responses and or head-to-head comparisons, things like that. I don't know that placebo-controlled trials will be very challenging unless they are done in other countries where access to EUA vaccines is much more limited. But there are a number of other candidates, as Dr. Locke showed, that were very close to phase 2 and or 3, and there are definitely some that are in phase 3 in Asia, South America, Africa, and different parts of the world. So
there are also a number of vaccines that are approved in other countries. The studies were not done in the US, so whether they would eventually become approved by FDA in this country remains to be determined. For example, we heard about the Russian vaccine and Chinese vaccine, and India also approved a couple of vaccines. So other countries are also making their own vaccines and doing their own clinical trials as well.
Yeah, and I think people, oh, go ahead, Anna. I'm sorry. I think I interrupted you.
No, that was just me.
Oh, I just wanted to make a point about the process of getting these through. As we're all talking about the vaccines that are out there, realize that AstraZeneca is now being used in the UK, but there were some issues, not necessarily with safety, but the way the studies were done that prevented our FDA from approving it because of the process that it has to go through. We have an advisory committee at the FDA, and then there's an advisory committee of experts at the called the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices at the CDC. And both those committees have to say yay before we accept the vaccines in this country. So be clear, we are doing, I think it's important to know that the US is being very careful, more careful than other countries in terms of approving these.
Okay, so our next question, how long can I delay the second dose?
This is actually a very good question because I think that many people heard that in the UK, there's a push to get everyone get the first dose, and even if there's not enough to give people the second dose in a timely manner, that's okay. I also see that some people say, well, is it okay if I just get one dose and forget about the second dose? Because the first dose seems to be working good enough that most people have an immune response. However, with many vaccinations, the second dose is like a booster to actually enhance your immune response to allow the immune response to last longer. So it's really more to make sure that you get a strong enough immune response to carry you through for a longer period of time. Now, if it's 3 weeks versus 3 weeks plus a few days, it probably wouldn't matter. But what we don't want people to do is really forget about the second dose in total, or wait so long that your initial immune response is almost faded away. And this is like getting your first dose all over again.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Anna. And we won't give 3 doses. So it's not as if we're going to start the dosing again. So in a year, you're not going to get more than 2 doses of either of these mRNA, the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine. And so it is very important to get that second dose because the first dose probably protects maybe 50%. And then if we talk about it may protect you even from severe disease, but then you might still spread the disease and it may keep the virus in the community enough that then the virus develops resistance. So it's very important. And right now we're sticking pretty firmly with wanting to give the second doses in the time period that the CDC is asking. That may change. It may change, but it won't change the fact that we still need to give those second doses.
Yeah, the official word from the CDC is that you can give it starting at 17 days, so 4 days before the second dose is due, and then as soon as possible thereafter.
Okay. So if you have received both vaccine doses, can you still be a carrier and possibly infect someone who has not been vaccinated?
Yes. Yes. That's well, is it possible? The answer is, I shouldn't say yes because the studies haven't been done, but probably. And that's the concern. That's why we can't just take our masks off once we're 3 weeks after our second dose. And we're more data to come out on that.
All right. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
The only thing I could think of is people don't always think of it as a two-way street, right? So if you're vaccinated, there's a good chance you're going to be protected against the virus, but you could still transmit the virus. So you could be a carrier, even though you don't become infected yourself. And so people need to keep that in mind that, even though they're vaccinated, we still have to protect other people.
But what it might allow us to do is things like maybe at a certain point, the teachers will be able to go to school and feel comfortable, even though they're wearing a mask to do teaching. Maybe we'll be able to go to restaurants and other places with our masks. And then when we see that we're safe, we'll be able to pull the masks off. So I think it's going to be a stepwise process.
Okay. I think we have time for another question. Let's see. When do you realistically see children being vaccinated?
Well, I'll jump into that. The clinical trials in children are ongoing, so we don't really have the results yet. Children in general actually respond to vaccines much better than adults, so I don't worry about that. But it's always a matter of safety. Some people even wonder, do children respond just as well if we give them a lower dose? I don't know if trials would test using a lower dose. But until we have the data, the children will be in the later phase. Hopefully by the time we get all the older people vaccinated, we have enough data that we'll be able to roll the vaccine out to the children.
Okay, and our last question, do you have any advice for people on where they should go to get the vaccine? The county, your health system, the pharmacy?
Wherever you can. And try multiple places. No, seriously, I think we're trying to get in all our patients who are 65 and over now. We're a university area too, so there are frontline essential workers at our university who we need to get vaccinated. So put your name in for us, but also put your name in for the health department. Put your name in for other areas. I think the sooner you can do it, the better.
Yeah, I think there's going to be more of a push to get vaccines into community pharmacies in the next month or so. So make sure you check with your local pharmacies or CVS or Walgreens. And also, definitely check with the county health department where you are, because they're the ones who are going to be providing vaccine to most of people that can't get it from their employer.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much. If you enjoyed today's topic, we invite you to join the Department of Internal Medicine's upcoming webinar, COVID-19 Treatments, Vaccines, and Long-Term Health Effects on January 26th at 12 p.m. A link to register will be sent in our follow-up messaging. And before we conclude today's webinar, I'd like to welcome Jennifer Edwards, the Senior Director for Michigan Medicine Development.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for offering your valuable time and expertise this afternoon. I want to thank all of our attendees for your engagement and interest. We hope you found this session informative and that you learned some things that might be applicable to your lives as we navigate the vaccination phase of this pandemic. We truly appreciate the opportunity to shine a spotlight on COVID-19 vaccines with an inside look at the development and rollout and we welcome future engagement with those of you who are interested in learning more. I want to extend our sincere thanks to our wonderful donor community who has joined us today, and a special thanks to those of you who have joined us throughout the last year to learn about Michigan Medicine's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and other important issues. We look forward to keeping you well aware of our activities in the months to come. As a reminder, a recording of the webinar will be sent in a follow-up email to those of you who registered, and a link to our Discovery Fund that assists faculty, like those you heard from today, in the research efforts to create breakthroughs and provide hope and healing for families across the state and around the world. There will also be videos of today's webinar posted to both our Michigan Medicine Facebook and YouTube page. Please join us next for the next Well Aware webinar, Follow Your Heart to Better Health, on February 11th at 1 p.m. During American Heart Month, Michigan Medicine experts will discuss advances in cardiovascular disease and ways to improve your heart health across all stages of your life. Please stay healthy and safe this winter. Thank you, and go Blue.